The scream was the only crown he had left, a crown of pure, unadulterated agony, worn for all his people to see. He had once commanded silence with a whisper. Now, his shrieks were the kingdom's new anthem. This is the story of how a king's reign ended not with a whimper, but with a sound that would haunt a nation for generations, a testament to the fact that when justice is forgotten, vengeance becomes its own horrifying form of art. Before the screams, there was silence, the chilling, heavy silence of a kingdom suffocating under the boot of its monarch, King Valerius of Aethelgard. His was not a rule of prosperity, but of paranoia. Every shadow was a potential traitor, every coin collected a testament to his greed. The spires of his castle didn't reach for the heavens in prayer. They clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers, a monument to his tyranny. His people learned to speak in whispers, to walk with their heads down, to pay taxes levied not on their wealth, but on their sorrow. But in the darkest corners of taverns and the quietest alleys, a different kind of whisper began to take root. It wasn't a prayer for mercy. It was a promise of retribution. A promise that one day, the silence would break. King Valerius did not ascend to the throne a monster. Those who remembered his youth spoke of a thoughtful prince, a young man who saw the hardship in his people's eyes. But the crown, once placed upon his head, proved to be a heavy, corrupting weight. It isolated him, feeding a deep-seated fear that his power was fragile. To make it absolute, he began to chip away at the soul of his kingdom. He started with the laws, twisting them from instruments of justice into tools of control. He established the Iron Guard, an elite force loyal only to him, their polished armor a terrifying sight in the muddy streets of the capital. His edicts became legendary for their cruelty. There was the sun tax, a fee for the light that fell on your crops. Then came the echo tax, a fine for speaking ill of the king, enforced by a network of spies who turned neighbor against neighbor. His punishments were public spectacles. A baker who couldn't afford the flour levy was left in the town square for a week, his hands bound in stocks filled with stinging nettles. A young woman who dared to weep too loudly for her conscripted brother was had her tongue branded. The Central Plaza, once a place of markets and festivals, became an open-air theater of pain, a constant reminder of the price of defiance. Inside the palace walls, the air was just as cold. Valerius surrounded himself not with wise counsel, but with sycophants who mirrored his own cruelty back at him. Feasts were held nightly, tables groaning under the weight of exotic foods, while beyond the gates, families boiled leather for sustenance. He would watch jesters perform, laughing a hollow, joyless laugh, his eyes always scanning the room, searching for the slightest hint of dissent in the faces of his courtiers. Fear was the currency of his court, and he was the wealthiest man alive. The people endured. For years they bowed their heads and paid their dues in coin and in blood. They learned to live with the hunger, the fear, and the quiet simmering rage that warmed them on cold nights. They told their children stories of better days, of kings who were just and harvests that were plentiful, tales that sounded more like fantasy with each passing year. The hope for a savior, for some noble lord to rise and challenge the tyrant, slowly withered and died. No one was coming to save them. If they wanted their lives back, they would have to take them. The turning point was not a grand battle or a noble declaration. It was a small, almost insignificant act of cruelty that finally broke the dam of the people's patience. A drought had ravaged the countryside, and the grain stores were nearly empty. Valerius, instead of providing relief, announced the crown's portion, a decree that half of what little remained was to be seized for the royal granaries. When a village elder, a man respected for his wisdom and kindness, pleaded on behalf of his starving community, Valerius had him executed on the spot. He called it a lesson in obedience. But it was a lesson that people learned differently. The elder's death was not a symbol of the king's power, but of his utter disregard for their lives. He didn't see them as his subjects, he saw them as his property. That night, the whispers in the alleys turned into plans. A blacksmith, whose son had been taken by the Iron Guard, began to forge not plows, but crude swords. A weaver, whose looms had been taxed into silence, began organizing secret meetings, her quiet voice a beacon in the darkness. A disgraced scholar, who had been punished for owning forbidden books, used his knowledge to draw maps of the castle's weaknesses. The rebellion had no single leader. Its heart was the collective will of a people who had nothing left to lose. Valerius, cocooned in his paranoia, sensed the shift in the air. He saw defiance in every downward glance, heard treason in every gust of wind. He doubled the patrols of the Iron Guard, their black cloaks becoming a plague upon the city. Arrests became more frequent, the screams from the palace dungeons a nightly lullaby. But every person they took, every family they destroyed, only created more rebels. The king's attempts to crush the dissent were like trying to smother a fire with gasoline. The betrayal, when it came, was not from the streets, but from within his own gilded cage. A captain of the royal guard, a man whose family had been ruined by the sorrow tithe, had been a silent conspirator for months. He had watched the king's descent into madness, his conscience slowly eating away at his loyalty. On the night of the planned uprising, as a storm raged over the kingdom, he did the unthinkable. He walked to a small, forgotten postern gate at the rear of the castle, a gate used for servants and supplies, and he unlocked it. He didn't do it for glory or power. He did it for the memory of the baker with the nettles, for the weeping woman with the branded tongue, and for the wise old elder who had dared to ask for bread. The storm that night was a perfect cover. While the king feasted, oblivious, the people moved. They were a motley army of farmers, merchants, and artisans, armed with pitchforks, hammers, and a fury that had been simmering for a decade. They poured through the open gate, a silent, vengeful flood. The Iron Guard, caught by surprise, was overwhelmed. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, a desperate clash not of armies, but of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. The sounds of steel and fury finally pierced the thick walls of the banquet hall. Valerius, his face pale with disbelief, was not found fighting on the ramparts with a sword in his hand. He was not discovered in the throne room, making a last defiant stand. He was found in his private chambers, huddled behind a tapestry, stripped of his crown, his robes, his dignity. He was just a man, a terrified, trembling man whose power had evaporated the moment his people decided they were no longer afraid of him. They dragged him from his hiding place and into the grand hall. The rebels, their faces smeared with blood and grime, parted to let him pass. They didn't cheer. They just watched, their eyes filled with a cold, hard satisfaction. The king who had demanded their silence was now met with it, and it was more terrifying than any war cry. His journey from the castle to the central square was a gauntlet of hatred. The faces he saw were not the bowed heads of subjects, but the hardened masks of accusers. They spat on him, threw mud at him, and whispered the names of the dead he was responsible for. His trial was a formality, a piece of theater for a conclusion that had already been written. It was not held in a court of law, but in the same public square where his victims had suffered. The judges were the people themselves, a panel of men and women who had lost everything to his tyranny. The baker with the scarred hands was there. The woman with the branded tongue was there. The son of the murdered village elder was there. One by one, they spoke. Not of legal statutes or precedents, but of their pain. Their testimonies were a litany of suffering, a testament to a decade of darkness. Valerius, chained and on his knees, tried to speak of order, of the burdens of leadership, but his words were hollow, meaningless echoes in a space filled with righteous fury. The verdict was delivered not by a judge, but by the roar of the crowd. Death. But a simple death, a quick swing of an axe or the snap of a rope, was not enough. That was a soldier's end, a clean end. They wanted something else. They wanted a death that mirrored his reign, slow, painful, and public. They wanted a spectacle that would cleanse the kingdom of his memory, burning it away with agony. They wanted not just to kill the king, but to unmake the man. The day of his execution was declared a national holiday. The entire city gathered in the square, a silent, expectant sea of faces. A massive iron platform had been erected, and on it lay not a chopping block, but an array of terrifyingly mundane tools. Tongs, hammers, chains, and braziers filled with glowing coals. The executioner was not one man, but several, each one chosen from the families of those he had personally wronged. This was not state-sanctioned justice. It was deeply personal revenge. They chained Valerius to an iron throne in the center of the platform, a cruel parody of his former seat of power. For a moment, a flicker of his old arrogance returned. He glared at the crowd, his lips curled in a sneer. He was still their king, and they were still peasants. But then, the first executioner, the blacksmith whose son had vanished, stepped forward. He held a pair of tongs heated in the coals until they glowed a malevolent orange. He approached the king, and the sneer on Valerius's face began to falter. He didn't go for the king's flesh at first. He went for his crown, or rather the place where it used to sit. He slowly, deliberately brought the searing metal close to the king's head. The crowd was breathless. The only sound was the crackle of the coals and Valerius's ragged breathing. His royal facade shattered completely, replaced by a primal fear. He began to beg, to promise them anything, riches, titles, freedom. But his words were drowned out by the hiss of hot iron meeting skin. And then, he screamed. It was a sound unlike any other. It was not a cry of pain, but a symphony of it. It was the sound of absolute power being reduced to absolute vulnerability. It was the sound of a god becoming meat. The crowd, which had thirsted for this moment, flinched. The sound was more real, more horrifying than they had ever imagined. The blacksmith pulled back, his face grim, and the next man stepped forward. This continued for what felt like an eternity. Each tool was used with a slow, methodical purpose, designed not to kill, but to dismantle. They broke his fingers, one by one, the same fingers that had signed their oppressive edicts. They tore at his skin, the same skin that had been draped in silk and velvet while they wore rags. His screams became the only thing that existed. They echoed off the stone buildings, a soundtrack to the people's liberation. But the satisfaction they had expected was twisted. It was mingled with a profound horror. They were watching a man, a tyrant, yes, but a man, being taken apart piece by piece. His shrieks of agony became pleas for mercy, then incoherent sobs, and then finally, just raw, animalistic noise. He was no longer King Valerius. He was just a body, a vessel of pain, a living monument to their collective rage. The feared monarch was gone, replaced by a screeching creature that bore no resemblance to the man who had once ruled them with an iron fist. The satisfaction on the faces in the crowd slowly curdled into a kind of grim, hollow silence as they realized the monstrosity of the spectacle they had craved. When the screaming finally stopped, the silence that fell over the square was heavier and more profound than the silence of fear he had once imposed. It was the silence of an ending, the silence of a great and terrible thing having been done. His broken form lay on the iron throne, a grotesque sculpture of vengeance. His voice was gone, his crown was gone, his life was gone.
The people stood for a long time, watching as if trying to understand what they had just witnessed and what they had just become. They had wanted justice. They had achieved revenge. But as they looked upon the ruin of their king, they saw a chilling reflection of the cruelty he had taught them. His name, Valerius, was never again associated with greatness or power. It became a whisper, a ghost story told to children about a king who didn't just die, but who was erased by the sound of his own agony. His legacy was not a dynasty or a monument, but a grotesque scream that would forever echo in the foundations of their new kingdom, a permanent stain on the soul of a people that had to become monsters, to slay one. If you enjoyed this untold story, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden History of Human Race for more hidden voices from history.